Hi there. Welcome to Conservation Conversations. This is where we dive deep into the trials and triumphs of conservation in Africa. And on this journey, we'll be dissecting Africa's conservation challenges and uncovering some really cool homegrown solutions.
Hi everyone, and welcome back to Conservation Conversations. In this podcast, we talk about all things conservation, everything from the challenges and the triumphs of protecting our planet to the stories and the strategies that are actually shaping the future of biodiversity protection in Africa. And of course, I'm your host, Elizabeth Gitari Mitaro. So if you have stayed with us since part 1, congratulations and very well done for being here and wanting to learn more about how we protect these invisible fences and bring them down. And so part 4 of this episode is called Invisible Fences, the Apex Predator. So we have spoken from part 1 to part 3 at length about the farmer, the rancher, the community land member, the community committee, the private landowner, whose fences fragment the landscape, the law, and how that translates to the invisible fence, what corridors are. But there's a predator who is far larger and more powerful than any individual landowner or even any single community. And that is the state itself or the government itself. What happens when the threat to a migration corridor doesn't actually come from a private title deed holder or from a government, but from a government infrastructural plan? It doesn't come from someone who wants to clear 100 acres in Amboseli to plant pineapples. It doesn't come from someone who has bought 300 acres right at the edge of Nairobi National Park and wants to put up villas and fence them. What happens when development as a national priority, backed by the flag and the Treasury and the defense forces of the Republic of Kenya, are actually the invisible fence that is creating and destroying our migratory corridors? For this, we have to look beyond our borders to the most significant environmental jurisprudence in East African history. And that is the case of the African Network for Animal Welfare, ANO, versus the Attorney General of the United Republic of Tanzania. About 10 years ago, more than 10 years ago, the stakes couldn't have been higher. The Serengeti ecosystem hosts the largest terrestrial mammal migration on Earth, a biological engine that drives the economies of both Kenya and Tanzania. Yet in 2010, the Tanzanian government announced plans to construct a commercial highway across the northern section of the Serengeti National Park. The road was intended to connect the hinterlands to the coast, a very valid developmental goal. Like, no one is opposed to roads. We need them. We cannot be, walking, transporting ourselves on donkeys and, by foot. However, the scientists warned that a tarmac highway that is cutting through a migration route of such international significance would act as a fatal barrier, potentially actually collapsing the wildebeest migration into a fraction of its size. The invisible fence was about to become a strip of asphalt. So when ANO, the organization that we've mentioned, which is a Kenyan NGO, filed suit in the East African Court of Justice, the legal pushback was immediate and it was fierce. Tanzania raised a defense based on the oldest principle in international law, sovereignty. And the argument was simple. This is Tanzanian land. We are a sovereign state. We have the right to build roads for our people. And there is no foreign court or NGO that can tell us otherwise. This is the equivalent of Article 40, just on steroids. Article 40 says, this is my land as a private landowner. I have the right to do whatever I want on my land. I have the right to build the fence. And there is no outsider or trespasser that can tell me otherwise. The court, however, looked at a higher law, the Treaty for the Establishment of the East African Community. Specifically, they focused on Article 114, which governs the management of natural resources within the East African Community. The treaty recognizes that ecosystems that are transboundary in nature, such as the Mara Serengeti ecosystem, do not actually respect any political borders. The wildebeest don't stop at, Isebania border to show a passport before they cross. Therefore, the management of these resources is actually a shared obligation. So the argument by Tanzania that no foreign government or foreign court or foreign NGO can tell us otherwise actually did not hold weight, because the court had to weigh the right of a nation to develop and its right to sovereignty against the duty of the region to conserve and the obligations enshrined within an actual signed treaty, which is the equivalent of a contract between countries. So in the judgment that was delivered in June of 2014, the East African Court of Justice sided with the ecosystem. The judges declared that the construction of a bitumen road across the wilderness was actually unlawful. And they didn't issue a warning. They actually issued a permanent injunction. For the very first time, a regional court told a sovereign government that its right to build infrastructure ended where the survival of a transboundary ecosystem began. The Serengeti Highway case proved that a wildlife corridor is not just a national asset. It's a regional responsibility. It established the duty to protect a migratory corridor over the narrow interests of national politics. And so the judgment serves then as a permanent warning to governments in the region. You can own the soil within your individual borders, and the integrity of the ecosystem belongs to the collective. So the battle between the sovereignty of the state and the survival of the corridor, the law at its highest level actually chose the survival of the ecosystem. So if we look at transboundary corridors as legal assets, and if we look at a political map of East Africa, we see distinct blocks of color. Kenya is yellow, Tanzania is green. It's separated by a sharp, definitive line. Like there's a very clear line. You can actually draw the map of Kenya. And the line is straight. The boundary is straight between Kenya and Tanzania. But if we look at the Serengeti Mara ecosystem and we look at the ecological map, it's not two ecosystems. It's a single ecosystem. There's no line that's demarcating that this is Mara Serengeti, this is Mara Kenya. It's one from the air. The wildebeest that calves on the short grass plains of Serengeti in February is the same animal that crosses the Mara River in July. To the herds, they actually have no idea whether there is a border such as Isebania where you and I, share our passports for stamping as we are crossing. It doesn't recognize the jurisdiction of Nairobi or Dodoma. The only jurisdiction they recognize is rain. When do we go when it's raining? When do we go when it's dry? Where do we go when we need to calve? And this is what transforms the wildlife corridor into an asset. Now, despite the ruling of the court in this case, we must be careful not to confuse the legal victory with the permanent solution. The law is that the Serengeti Highway is illegal. The injunction starts because it's a permanent injunction. But the fact is, the pressure to build remains. Political change, economies demand shorter trade routes. We have the AFTA agreement to implement. The memory of a court judgment actually fades faster than the desire for infrastructure. And we've seen numerous attempts to actually bypass the ruling. The proposal for gravel roads that will inevitably, widen into highways, and renewed political rhetoric around sovereignty. So a court order is only as strong as the political will to enforce it. So the paper order of the law can maintain the status quo, but can it really patrol the border? This situation demands that we treat migration not just as a biological wonder, the seventh wonder of the world, but as a shared economic and legal asset. Until we codify this shared ownership into a binding bilateral treaty beyond just court orders, then we will forever be, in a legal quagmire and under siege. We are safe on paper, but always one election away from destruction. And so this idea that the government actually is the apex predator when it comes to the protection of wildlife corridors is not an idea that is gotten from the clouds, but something that is in actual, that is actually happening currently. Even save for transboundary resources, we have court cases that are ongoing for the protection of the Abadia ecosystem, where the Kenyan government wants to build a highway through it. We have the Usahihi Highway that is being proposed to go through some very critical wildlife corridors within the Chulus and southern Kenya and the Savos. In as much as they don't touch the Savo National Park and the protected areas, remember what we said in episode 1, part 2 of this series, that 65% of wild animals are actually on private and community land. And so even as we think about how to bring down the invisible fences, we have to think about bulletproofing and guardrailing the propensity of the state and the government with every single election cycle from destroying the very thing that we rely on as a country for our survival. Now, outside of the government as an additional sort of predator in respect to the invisible fences conversation, for decades, the economic argument for the wildlife corridor has entirely been dependent on, the camera lens, the tourism dollar, the dependency on the tourism dollar. We told communities that the value of their land actually lay in tourism numbers, in the safari jeep, in the park fee, in the hotel and bed night fee. And that's not false, Tourism prefers, billions of shillings to the gross domestic national product. But 2020 and COVID taught us that tourism is a fickle tenant. The slightest sign of instability will leave the conservancies bankrupt and the fences rising. We saw that with COVID. We've seen that with every single, rise in terrorism alerts. But there's a new invisible asset class that has emerged from the land, from the savannah, which is actually altering the valuation of African landscapes. we are at the precipice and we are literally witnessing the dawn of market-based conservation, where the primary export is not a photograph of the lion, is not the experience to see the lion, but the very air we breathe. This is the era of the carbon credits, of the biodiversity credits. And for the wildlife corridor, it actually represents a shift from precarious charity to a tangible, tradable commodity. Under the framework of REDD+, which stands for Reducing Emissions from Deforestation and Forest Degradation, the act of not destroying an ecosystem becomes a billable service. So when a conservancy prevents charcoal burning or halts the plowing of a migratory route, it actually generates avoided emissions. And these are, verified, packaged, and sold as credit to corporations in the global north. So whereas before it was quote unquote land lying bare, there is an empty corridor where there was previously an empty corridor. There's no longer wasteland, it's now literally a bank vault. And for years, the concept of the wild west of conservation law, the carbon cowboys, unregulated brokers, they have been around for a while, selling opaque deals, promising millions, locking ancestral lands into lopsided contracts. We're not saying that those haven't been there, but the vast majority of the projects within the carbon sector have actually been life-altering for communities. And this has actually previously existed without the existence of any law. But in 2023, the Climate Change Act was amended, and it brought the elusive carbon market regulation under the strict purview of the state, moving from defining carbon trading as a private hustle to a regulated authority, activity under the oversight of the designated national authority. It introduced, compliance mechanisms, benefit sharing structures, specific percentages that need to go to communities, aligning with the Community Land Act, creating a statutory shield against exploitation, profiling that the pastoralist in the Churu Hills and the Northern Rangelands is actually not just a spectator anymore, but an actual participant and a shareholder in the asset. So from the wildlife corridor perspective and the invisible lenses perspective, the carbon and the biodiversity assets contract provides a long-term tenure that, tourism wouldn't be able to guarantee without the attendant risks that apply. So even if the carbon project typically spans, 20 to 30 years, which essentially is a generation, there are inbuilt mechanisms for how the revenue and the benefit sharing would stack and would essentially rise as the years go by, right? So in as much as the current global carbon market is a high-stakes frontier with actual significant financial, clashes, carbon finance provides an actual critical lifeline for conservation than traditional philanthropy and monetizing of ecosystems. And so understanding that dichotomy actually requires a very deep dive into operational realities of some of the projects that are there in this country, so that we remove the predatory, practices of unregulated, snake oil salesmen to actual legal professionals playing in this very complex landscape. We must ask ourselves, what must be done now? What's the legal toolkit for 2026 and what does that look like? So number one, like we've said, we must move from being reactive litigators to proactive architects of compliance, looking at innovations and how they can be used, for example, the conservation easements that we talked about in the previous part, right? We must look at figuring out the primary tool for conservation and for the protection of land and the conservation of wildlife into perpetuity. We must look at how to empower communities to operate within the Community Land Act of 2016 and to guide the communities through the conversion process, the drafting of the bylaws, the electing of the community land management committees, right? We must figure out how to support communities to negotiate carbon deals. How do we talk about the 40% of aggregate, earnings getting to the communities, and what does that look like? We must go after and reframe conservation not just as charity, but a special form of commercial land use, that a conservation lease is as complex as a commercial property lease in Karen or Upper Hill, that we are treating the assets that accrue from nature with the same seriousness that other assets that accrue from the financial markets are actually, attract. We must move from activism to protection, that we're not calling environmental lawyers activists anymore, that we are looking at transactional ecologists, structuring deals that keep forests standing, which requires a hybrid of skills, understanding the science, drafting accurate project descriptions, being an FPIC expert, and streamlining FPIC into agreements, understanding the anthropology of local communities, and ensuring that they give actual genuine consent. So as we come to the end of this series of Invisible Fences, we have the legal toolkit to fix the gap. We see the financial opportunity in conservancies, in carbon markets, in biodiversity markets, but we must choose the legacy of the open corridor ensure that centuries from now, we still have elephants roaming the plains of savannah. And the choice is actually ours to make today. We choose to see the invisible fences and to fix the gaps that exist. And until next time, I'm your host, Elizabeth Butari.